Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Hodala, and this is a post-recording of the Using the Grades tool. If you were live with us on the webinar yesterday, you know that the first half of the webinar didn't actually get recorded. So we've gone ahead and re-recorded this part. Now, as a result, there may be some overlap between what we talk about right now and the second video when we actually managed to get the recording to work. So please forgive us about that little bit of overlap, but hey, you'll get to hear it a second time, which is never a bad thing. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Carrie Huffman, to start us off with some introductions. So Carrie, over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Before we begin, we just want to note that any of the questions that were in the Q&A pod, those would have been addressed in the session. We also want to note that any questions specifically related to the VLE, you will want to direct to your board's telecontact or summer school supervisor. So as we work through this session, especially for those of you that are watching this and were not able to join us, you may notice that what you see in your board system is not necessarily what you will see in this webinar, as boards have customized and tailored their virtual learning platforms. So Paul and I will do a demonstration. Again, if it doesn't align with what you see, that's okay. We hope that most of what you see is similar and that you will be able to navigate that. So I am going to begin. So hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Huffman, and I'm an education officer with the Ministry of Education, seconded from the Thames Valley District School Board. I'm a former district e-learning contact, and learning technologies coordinator, and then the online summer school coordinator with a Master in International Education. And I was an online educator and English teacher for several years prior to coming into this role. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Paul to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Carrie. My name is Paul Hodala. I'm also an education officer with the Ministry of Education. I was formerly head of science at Ancaster High School in the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. I've been an online educator as well as a technology-enabled learning and teaching contact prior to coming to the ministry as an education officer. I've also taught at both Brock University in the Faculty of Education, as well as McMaster University in the Department of Chemistry and Biological Chemistry. Carrie, back over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. So before we begin, we just wanted to highlight some of the learning goals and things that we will cover in this webinar. So during this presentation, you will get oriented to the grades tool. That's our ultimate goal here. And during this webinar, we will explore using the setup wizard, creating categories, adding grade items, and linking assessments. So to begin, we want to talk a little bit about why use the grades tool. So 3 reasons that really stood out for us. So the fact that it's a one-stop shop, there is that mark transparency, and we find that it really does motivate students. So when I taught my first e-learning course, I actually didn't use the grades tool. That's how long ago it was. So I would, if I was doing this now, when I was doing it then, I would update students once a week with a markbook file or via email. So if I wasn't coding names, I was sending individual emails, and it was really time consuming. So using the grades tool made it easier for me to give students access to their marks without all of that work. So as soon as I graded an item and updated the mark, the students instantly had access to that. And having taught ENG for you many times, I always found my students were so eager to have that mark update, and they were really anxious about that. And that shifted once I used the grades tool. I also found it motivated students. So that timely feedback, not having to wait until I sent out an update, and the fact that any rubric I used or feedback I provided was always attached to their assignments, I found really helpful. It's that accountability piece for everyone. So aligning the grade with the feedback I found was really effective. And then because the students can always go back and view that feedback to better understand how to improve, I found that the results were a little bit better, and my communications were more focused on giving students that feedback and having conversations rather than specifically what the mark was. So the first thing we want to talk about to get started is the grades setup wizard. But before we do that, I just wanted to highlight a few of the things that you will want to consider before I start the demo. So in this grades setup wizard, so as soon as you go into that grades tool, which I will model coming up, there are some things you really want to think about. So you will need to determine whether you want to have weighted grades or points, whether you want to release the calculated or the adjusted final grade. Do you want ungraded items to be a 0? Do you want to set up a grade scheme? even down to choosing the number of decimal places that you want students to see with their marks. And again, what you want them to see in general. So those are all options. One thing we do want to say is that you can go through the setup wizard and change your settings at any point. So what you start your course off with might not be what you want them to see sort of midpoint, which I will talk about coming up. But again, lots of things to consider when you are going through this setup process. So again, when considering setting up and using the grades tool, you will also want to determine how growing success will be reflected in your setup. So going back to the idea of most recent, most consistent, if you leave ungraded items as 0, then the most recent, most consistent cannot really be factored in. So if you release calculated grade, sometimes this can be misleading to students if they aren't aware of zeros, unless you're using them to motivate students, which again might be more effective in a 4U class than it would be in a 1P class, as grades directly impact university admission. So all things to consider as well. And sometimes boards will actually allow you to use the grades tool exclusively and then just submit a final mark into the software being used to house those learning skills, work habits, and comments. So that is something you will also need to think about. However, Markbook software, if that is what your board uses even today, this will talk to the grades tool. So just make sure you identify those expectations from your board and really take those into consideration when you are setting up the tool. And just before we begin the demo, I just wanted to highlight some of the resources that are available. So the gradebook guide is something that the ministry's worked in collaboration with D2L to really highlight those step-by-step processes and to provide you with some examples of what it might look like and what your gradebook can look like. There's also some videos on setting up your gradebook, as well as using the grade setup wizard. So I will walk you through that momentarily. But again, knowing that these resources are in place, hopefully will offer you some additional support outside of this webinar. So on that note, what I want to do is just bounce into my course. So this is my MDM for You data management course. And you'll notice here that I actually have the grades icon, the grades tool, sitting on my navigation bar. So if this isn't something that you see, you'll notice when I hover over here to the right, I actually have these 3 dots. And if you hover away, you don't see it. So make sure you hover over. And if you don't see that grades tool, you will want to add it. So when I click on actions for navbar and I go to edit this navbar, if you haven't done this step before, you will have to make a copy. So you will be prompted. So just make sure you make that copy. And then what you will see once you make that copy is this. So any links that you currently have are listed right here. If you want to get rid of them, you can just hover over that X and get rid of them. And if you want to add links, for example, so I will take that grades tool off and I'll show you how to add it here. So all I want to do here in this link is I want to search for grades. So I'm just going to type grades in, and then this icon appears. So I want to select it and then add it. And this is an important one, so I want it to be here, so I'm just going to drag and drop it. And then as soon as I click Save and Close, I will have that grades tool on my nav bar. So that is really important to have that there. You could access it through the course admin if you like, if you don't want the grades tool up there, and maybe your course has started and you want to put it up after. So you can also scroll down here to assessment, and then you could access the grades tool from there. But in this instance, I'm going to click on that grades tool right up here at the top. And what I want to do is I actually want to walk you through this setup wizard. So I'm going to click on setup wizard. Some of the standard settings and the default settings are there, but I'm going to ignore that. And I just want to click start. So your first step, as I mentioned in the slide deck, is to determine whether you want a weighted system or a point system. I know that Paul, who's here with me, is more of a fan of the points. He comes from a science background, and I know a lot of math teachers that do prefer the points. Because I'm an English background, I love my weighted section. So Paul will go into a little bit more detail about the points coming up. I prefer the weight, and I'll explain that in a little bit. If you're using the points, your math has to be on point, so pardon the pun. But you will have to make sure that everything adds up if you're using the point system. So in this case, I'm going to choose weighted. I'm going to click continue. And then my next determination is whether I want to release the calculated final grade or that adjusted final grade, and whether I want things to be automatically released for the students. So My decisions here, so the calculated final grade, again, this doesn't allow for rounding. It doesn't allow necessarily for adjusted items without editing the grade item score. So if you're rounding up or you're looking at most recent, most consistent, the calculated grade does not allow you to make those edits unless you are editing the grade items specifically. The adjusted final grade does allow for that. So it does allow for that modification. It does allow for, you to take into consideration the most recent, most consistent. So that is one thing that I really like to use. And again, I don't release that final grade to students after. So I'm going to leave all of those unchecked except for adjusted final grade, knowing that I can come back into the setup wizard and then release that at a different time. Okay, so I'm going to click continue. My next is the grade calculation. So this goes back to the conversation we had briefly earlier on growing success. So do I want to drop the ungraded items or treat the ungraded items as 0? And this might be impacted by your familiarity with the course. So I know in instances where I taught a course and it was my first time through, and I think, maybe that assessment that I provided didn't have clear enough instructions. My students weren't very successful on it, and I'm going to take some of the responsibility for that. So in that case, treating ungraded items as 0 wouldn't be helpful. So I may just want to drop those ungraded items and make sure that I put in a 0 where they're supposed to be. So again, it's entirely up to you and your teaching preference, and this may be impacted by your course. But what I would recommend is automatically keeping that final grade updated, because that's a really good overview for you as the teacher to know sort of where students are at. So I'm gonna choose drop ungraded items. Ungraded items is 0. I don't think is a motivating factor for my students this summer, so I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to continue. So step 4 is determining a grade scheme. So the default is percentage. Paul will walk you through some of the reasons why you might want to use a grade scheme coming up. I could add a scheme if I wanted to. So if I do want to assess my students on that 13-point scale, have my 4 plus, my 4 minus, and attach points to it, I could absolutely do that and create a scheme. I am more of a percentage kind of person, so I am going to stick with the default. This means that any assignment that I grade will automatically be given a percentage. So I'm going to leave the default there and choose it. If you were to create a scheme, they would simply appear below under your customized schemes there and not under the organization scheme. So keep that in mind if that's something that you would like to do. And again, Paul will walk you through that coming up. So I've got my scheme that I've chosen. Step 5 is just managing those view display options. So I like to see 2. This is more for me than it is for the students, so that I know how I'm rounding at the end of my summer school semester. So I'm going to leave that as 2. You can have as many or as little as you like. Some prefer to have it as the 0. That way, is easier to sort of manage. But again, when you think about the student display options, which is this final step, whether you want those 2 decimal places or not, depending on the course that you're teaching. So if I'm thinking about my MDM for You course, I may want to have those 2 decimal places so students can see my rounding and kind of know where their grades are going to be. I want to grade and the weighted grade. So just because I've chosen weighted doesn't mean that I can't assign points items, so that's also something to consider. So I would just check off the points in the weighted, especially if you're not sure. If you want to add a scheme symbol, so if you are using, exclusively those 4 plus 4 may want, and if you want to use color with your grade schemes, again, you could check those off as well, but you will want to create those grade schemes before checking that off. The number of characters to display for text items, that really has to do with the items that you see in the grades book. So 15 is usually okay. And then again, this display final grade calculation to users, I typically would leave that up, but again, it's entirely up to you. See, where they're going, and they could use that to set some goals. Entirely up to you. And this is really, as soon as I click continue, I'm just going to see all of the decisions and the choices that I've made appear here. And as soon as I click finish, then my grade book is set up. And then from here, what I would do then is to create but before we do that, I'm just going to flip back to the presentation. A little bit about and what this means. So we know that there are some boards that assess using the student achievement chart. So they do assess you just want to make sure that however you've created your categories, whether it's through Kiko or whether it's through those overall expectations, that's just made clear to students before you begin. See those categories when they go into, but again, just having a little bit of, planning and forth this gradebook is really important so that you don't have to go back and edit your work. So some things to think about when you are setting up your categories. So you will need to determine your categories. So that's overall expectations that you want to assess against, or whether that's your or application. Just make sure you determine those categories because that's the first thing you're going to want to enter into this gradebook. Next thing you want to do is category. Putting weights to the knowledge category, the inquiry, application, you just want to make sure that everything adds up to 100. And we know that you're probably going to have a culminating activity or a culminating task and or an exam. So you just want to make sure that those are also identified as categories or items within your category to make sure that everything adds to 100, which I will talk about coming up. So really important to the other thing to consider is that if you want to have a category where all of the students' rough work is, and that's where you're giving sort of that formative feedback and some formative marks for them to apply for you can have categories that do not have to be included in the grades calculation. So something to consider as well when you are creating those. And again, just as in the last section, we just wanted to provide you with some additional resources outside of this slide deck. So if you need some help creating a grade category or hiding grade items or categories that you maybe don't want to include in that final assessment, in just that link to Growing Success to support, or if you have any questions about it, we have included all of those here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip back to my course and talk a little bit about creating a new category. So if I'm in Manage Grades, I can create a new category there, but I'm here in the Setup Wizard, so I'm just going to click Create a New Grade Category. And to do that, you'll notice all of those considerations come into place. So if I want to do my communication, my short name is C. This is a math course, so I'm going to leave my communication weighted at 20, knowing that knowledge will be 20, inquiry will be 20, communication and application will all be 20. And that leaves me that extra 20 to add up to 100 or the culminating task, whatever I would like that to be. So when you're creating a category, you also want to think about that grade item distribution. So I can manually assign weight to every item in the category. This sort of gets me outside of that points mindset where I could have all of my assessments and then, based on most recent, most consistent, or based on student success, I can manually assign weights to items in my category to make them worth a little bit more to help the grades of my students. I think an assignment is more reflective of student achievement, then I can do that. If you distribute weights by points across all items in the category, what that means is that any grade item that is worth more points will be worth more in weight, which works sometimes, again, depending on how you assess your students. So if you have an essay or an exam that's out of 120 points and then a quiz out of 10, then it kind of works. But I mean, for myself, I'm in a math course, but I come from an English, would prefer to manually assign those weights to you and entirely, maybe. The third distribution option is to distribute weight evenly items. This could be problematic, so just letting you know, I mean, maybe you've set up your course in a way where all equally is important, especially in summer school. It is easier to do that than it would be during the So if that's something that you would want to do, by all means. But again, this also means that every single item in there, regardless of the amount of time, so it could be, you know, a pop quiz as well as an problem or an exam would all be worth the same thing. So, but again, something to consider depending on how you've set up. What I'm saying is I'm going to choose the manually assigned weight to items in the category to allow myself a little bit more flexibility. I don't want to display my class average to users or the grade distribution on their own achievement this summer instead of constantly comparing. I find that that's always given me more questions from students than it has to really help them. And again, lots of other options here. This is what I've chosen in my setup wizard. So this reminder of what students. As soon as I'm done, I'm going to close. And then when I go down here, you can see that this is where all of my weighting is. So my final calculated grade and my final adjusted grade will always show up there. But again, if I wanted to add another category, so I am here in the manage grades section. So if you don't get to add a new setup wizard and you are coming back in, when you're in manage grades, this is where you're going to add a new category. So I'm going to quickly just add my application one here so you can see everything in its entirety. I want to have my 20 there, manually assign, and I'm going to click save and new, and this will allow me to create, want to have an exam in my course. I'm going to make this weighted out of 20 so that my math adds up, and everything else I will leave the same, and then I'm going to click save and close. So when I go back to my gradebook, all of my categories are in place. So I have each of these from the student achievement chart, so those are there, as well as my exam. And then what happens is I add grade items in. You'll notice here that you get just some notifications here at the top in terms of things not adding to zero, which Paul will talk about coming up. I also just wanted to highlight that you could also have your grades set up via just one. I mean, here's what that looks like. So when I go to, I apologize, manage grades, again, I'm getting all of these isn't adding up, but this is what that would look like. So expectation, my first one of counting and probability, and then if I want to do counting and probability, that's my second overall expectation. You'll know a little bit different. So because I don't have those 4 categories and I have, you know, significantly more, I've done is I've adjusted my weights accordingly. So if I was to scroll down, I'm making it so that each of these overall expectations is worth around the same amount. Because I'm looking at more, you know, most recent, most consistent, I've made 7, these ones here 8, and then statistical analysis is a very small portion of what my class would be. So and you can adjust those accordingly based on T's. And then again, in this instance, I'm task as a category instead of mostly just to highlight the options that you have here with creating categories. So on that note, I'm just going to shift back over and I'm going to here to Paul to talk about grade items. And this does bring us to the end of the recording that was missed. So again, just want to apologize for that. And I'm going to stop the recording now.